We can now bring in Scott Lucas, professor of international politics at the Clinton Institute, University College Dublin. Scott, thank you so much for joining us on the program today. So it seems the news today is that Iran is hardening its tone a bit over the Strait of Hormuz. We've seen the Revolutionary Guard say there's no way that it's going to reopen unless the United States meets its demands. We've heard the foreign minister say they aren't negotiating with the U.S., only exchanging messages through intermediaries. What do you make of all of this?
Well, I think the Iranian regime is just restating its position, which is, as Fraser Jackson pointed out, look, we had this memorandum of understanding, which in general terms not only set out that Iran would manage the Strait of Hormuz in conjunction with others like Oman, but also that in exchange for opening up the Strait of Hormuz, the U.S. blockade on Iranian ports would be lifted, sanctions would be lifted, Iran would receive billions of dollars in unfrozen assets. Indeed, there was even this private reconstruction investment fund, which could have been worth up to $300 billion. What has happened in the last few days is that if Iran, in these talks with Oman, does indeed complete an agreement on the management of the strait, an agreement that would be between 60 and 120 days. It's not as much that they could impose tolls or possibly call them fees. It's also that they could say, look, the strait is a matter of our security as well, and therefore we expect the U.S. to live up to certain conditions. Now, they are setting a very high bar for those conditions, including the withdrawal of U.S. forces from parts of the Middle East. But I think that's just because they have this leverage over the strait. They're going to set their demands quite high. And then that means they can then negotiate them down if the Americans come to the table.
Now, J.D. Vance gave an interview to Fox News Saturday. In that interview, he said that Iran is hurting in a big way and they just want this to be over. Do you agree with his assessment?
That's bluster. I mean, I'm an analyst. I deal with reality, not the rhetoric that comes out from either side, from the Americans or from the Iranians. And the fundamental here is, yes, Iran has taken more than $300 billion in damage. It has lost its supreme leader. It's lost officers and commanders. It has a huge job of repairing infrastructure if we get a protracted ceasefire. But the fundamental here is, first of all, the Iranian regime has survived all those attacks. Secondly, the Iranians still have their nuclear program, and indeed the Americans may have to concede that Iran will continue uranium enrichment when this war is over, albeit not to the level it's at now. And thirdly, that Iran has not only established this control over the Strait of Hormuz, Iran has been able to retaliate across the Middle East and continues to retaliate across the Middle East, including against the Gulf states. And on top of all that, I think that Vice President Vance is not mentioning the fundamental fact. A week ago, just over a week ago, the Trump administration considered widening its attacks inside Iran, returning to the war. And the American military said, you have a shortage of air defense interceptors. You cannot protect your allies if Iran retaliates. And secondly, you now have a shortage of offensive munitions. So you cannot expand this war to the point where the regime will surrender. That's the fundamental, even if Mr. Vance is going to try to deny it in his public statements.
You bring that up. U.S. media has been reporting that Dan Kane, the general, has been looking for an off-ramp. He's sort of been having private talks with top administration officials saying that he doesn't think they can achieve the goals militarily. So, I mean, at this point, the Iranian regime has to know that. Do you think they're trying to outweight Washington?
Oh, I think this explains why we start off with the idea of Iran setting those fairly high demands. The U.S. must lift sanctions. They must unfreeze our assets. They must pull back from the Middle East because they know that militarily the Trump folks do not have an option unless they were going to put in ground troops, which they have rejected doing so. And there's also, the Iranians will realize this, the administration split because the interesting point is that Dan Kane has been in discussions with, for example, J.D. Vance. Why is that important? because J.D. Vance, for all his bluster, has also been the U.S. official who has been opposed to this war from the beginning. So it's not just a case of the military considerations here. It's also the political considerations where Vance is looking for an off-ramp as well as Kane, because let's add another factor in here. More than 70% of Americans oppose this war, and the Republicans and the Trumpists are facing congressional elections in November. Why is that important for J.D. Vance? He wants to be president in 2028. And if the Republicans and Trumpists do badly because of this war in Iran, his chances will be hurt in achieving that goal.
Now, Scott, it's been nearly 6 months since this conflict began. And as you've discussed, there's things that both sides want, a way for each of them to be able to go back home and say, we scored a victory on this. So with that, thinking of that, is there a way, do you see, to get them back to the negotiating table, Tehran and Washington?
Well, I think there will have to be a return to negotiations because of this fundamental that the U.S. has run out of military options. It's just a question now that if you cannot break open the Strait of Hormuz, if you can't force the regime to surrender, you have to talk to them. Now, will that be within days? Will that be within weeks? That's, I think, an open question. I expect once we get back from the recess, Washington is effectively on holiday for the next month. After the first Monday in the U.S., which is Labor Day, I think that'll be the pressure point where the Americans will come back to the table. The question will be, will they come back to the table on the basis of that memorandum of understanding, which Donald Trump signed in June, albeit without consulting his senior advisors, or will they try to walk away from that memorandum of understanding and go back to square one in the negotiations? Because if they do that, the Iranians will immediately say that the Americans are cheating on the deal and will definitely continue to keep the Strait of Hormuz shut until the Americans not only return to talks, but do so on terms that at least meet the Iranians with some of their demands. In other words, the Americans are in a worse political position than they were on February 26th when they met the Iranians 2 days before the war started.
Now, Iran state television has just released new archive footage, so it's not fresh footage of the supreme leader. Our correspondent there was saying that this is a message from the authorities to the people of Iran, hinting that he's still alive and well. What do you think it means?
And we just had another message in the past hour from President Pezeshkian, who said he met with Mojtaba Khamenei today. Now, of course, there's no way we can verify that. There's no way we can verify, current footage because you're talking about archive. So we can only speculate in terms of, if Khamenei is alive, what is his state? Is he mentally fit? Is he physically fit? But the fundamental here is that it doesn't matter in a way if he is alive or dead, because the regime at this point can carry on with the position as long as the Americans are the threat of going to the public and saying, look, this is your country, this is your nation, and the supreme leader is the symbol of that nation. Where the state of the supreme leader will become important, and indeed where the state of the regime will become important, is if we have a lasting ceasefire. Because at that point, we go back to the position back in January, where there were nationwide political and economic protests, serious protests that the regime had to put down by killing at least thousands of people, possibly tens of thousands. And that issue of regime legitimacy is going to come back, including the position of the supreme leader. But as long as the U.S. threatens war against Iran, the regime doesn't have to face that legitimacy question, because they can tell Iranians, we are not your threat. The Americans and the Israelis, they're your threat.
And Scott, just one quick final question. You mentioned the Iranian president there. He's been someone who's been pro-negotiation. He's discussed that he thinks that's the answer here. Hardliners, members of the Revolutionary Guard, not so interested in negotiations. So do you think this is showing cracks in the regime between the moderates and the hardliners?
No, I think that story of cracks in the regime has largely been Western disinformation, especially coming from the Americans and the Israelis. There are differences with some elements, and it's a very complex Iranian system, certain members of the Iranian parliament who might not have wanted negotiations. But the issue amongst the key factors here, or the key players here, which includes the government, which includes the Supreme Leader's office, which includes the military, is not whether or not we negotiate with the Americans, but the terms that we set with the Americans. And I think, as we have been discussing, the fact that the Iranians are setting relatively tough terms with the Americans shows that the political, the clerical, and the military wings are pretty much on the same page here, that they do want this war to end, but they want to gain a significant advantage out of the way that it ends.
Scott, thank you so much for sharing your expertise with us and speaking with us on the Bulletin. That's Scott Lucas, Professor of International Politics at the Clinton Institute, University College Dublin.